Welcome back to the Christian Bitcoin podcast. I'm here today with Adam Livingston. My name is Tim Fox. I'm the executive director of the Magnalia Foundation. We help churches to understand and to use Bitcoin and other emerging technologies for the glory of God and to understand them all in the light of Scripture and Christian theology. And I'm joined today by Adam. Adam is a Bitcoin educator online, and he is also a Christian, and he's going to be talking with us today about how these things have come to intersect for him. Adam, why don't you introduce yourself, add anything else that you think I've missed, and tell us a little bit about how you became a Christian, and then we'll get later into some Bitcoin stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, Tim. Really appreciate it. My name is Adam Livingston. I am known as the Bitcoin Wizard. That is the name that I gave myself and thought it stuck. It's really funny. A lot of people ask, Adam, why do you call yourself the Wizard? And I thought, why would I wait for people to give me that nickname? I'll just own it. So I make a relentless stream of what I call the orange gospel content on Bitcoin, but I am a servant of my Savior, Jesus Christ. I am a Christian, have been since about May of 2021, and I have a very interesting journey there. So that's a bit about me. I love Bitcoin. I love Jesus. I love God. And I'm just excited to talk about how these intersect today, because I would rather talk about probably nothing else in life. So thank you so much for having me, Tim. I would say that my faith journey is a very interesting one. I look back on my life and I've always been very skeptical of religion, especially organized religion. I remember being age 8 and 9, going to a very small Catholic church when I was a wee lad, super young fella. I remember my CCD classes, like having skepticism about some of the biblical stories. But I come from a poor family. We moved around a lot, and we didn't really have a very consistent church family because we were always moving around everywhere. We could never really put our roots down. And then as I became a teenager, I just became autodidactic. And unfortunately, it was the same time that the new atheism movement was coming about. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, all of these guys writing books about God not being real, arguments against organized religion, and I unfortunately got totally sucked in. So I remained a hardcore atheist for quite a long time, over half of my life, actually, I think, which is really sad. But I was in a pit of despair that I was not even aware that I was in. And eventually, I came to Jesus in 2021 when I had a coworker of mine who actually was one of the few people in my life that wanted to have in-depth conversations about existential philosophical topics like free will, morality, just the things that people casually talk about at work, right? But anyway, he invited me to his church and to meet with his pastor, and I felt the truth. I began my relationship with Jesus in May of 2021, and I have not looked back. I feel like I have been saved. I know I have been saved. I have felt the gospel. I felt the truth. I raced home to read the Gospels, stayed up until 2 a.m. reading the Gospel of John, just totally amazed at this beautiful truth, this divine revelation that has been revealed to me, and I am beyond blessed. So in a nutshell, I can go into more detail, but that is how I got to where I am today.
What did you find so compelling about atheism at the time?
That's a great question. I think that what a lot of atheists get trapped in, and this is what I got trapped in, was having an inadequate conception of God itself. That concept of God, something greater than us. It's like we are yearning to understand what existence itself was derived from. And when you try to go through that tricky process of defining God's attributes as somebody who is, just not totally capable of understanding the totality of the truth and the majesty of what God actually is, I just think it's very easy to dismiss a concept when you don't have an exact definition of God's properties. I didn't understand the transcendental categories that lead us to experience God. I wasn't totally appreciative of truth and beauty and how these things lead us to know God personally. And when you are kind of looking at the world through a way of this lens of materialism, like physical matter, I think that you are not yearning into these transcendental categories. And to me, it's clearly inadequate, but at the time when you're an atheist, you're kind of looking at things through this realm. And once you start to understand and question your prior presuppositions about your worldview, it's really hard to justify continue being an atheist. How do you make an account for things like truth and beauty, these things that we rely on every day to form our worldview, without giving a justification for them? So I would say it's a conception of what God is. Atheists, they have an inadequate conception in their mind, and it needs to be fully formed.
But when you were an atheist, why were you an atheist? What appealed to you about it? C.S. Lewis said that when he was an atheist, he was angry at God for not existing. Is that something like what you were going through, or was it more kind of sterile than that? Like, well, this is just logical, or I guess it's just true.
It was a lot more sterile than that. And I do remember C.S. Lewis saying that. And honestly, when I was an atheist, I always got put off by that critique where you're just angry at God. I remember multiple interviews with Christopher Hitchens where they would tell him, why are you just angry? And it's, at least at the time, I didn't necessarily feel anger. I legitimately thought I was taking a logical account for things and evaluating the arguments, whether or not an uncaused cause could be justified philosophically. To me, I was definitely not emotional about it. I thought I was taking a logical accounting of things, but I don't know. It's tough to look back on my emotions and how I was wrestling with that question as a teenager. I do want to set aside my ego. Maybe there was some anger, but when I look back on that, I don't, at least to my feelings, how I feel, I don't think it was anger, but it's always a question of how in tune you are with your emotions. Maybe you were. Regardless, I was definitely in a huge pit of despair once you recognize your own fallibility as a person, and how the earthly things that we strive for, none of them are adequate enough. And I had a savior that was 100% necessitated the entire time, but I just didn't know that. So I don't know. Honestly, I didn't feel anger, at least in my mind. But yeah, I do understand why some people would think that.
So you became a Christian out of a profound despair about life, about its purpose. What was it about Christianity on the flip side that met and satisfied that despairing outlook?
I think that Christianity has given me a path forward for how I should spend my time. I remember before I came to God, I was just always interested in philosophy, and I was not doing things that probably should be recommended to young teenage men seeking the truth, like reading German existential philosophy at 2:00 in the morning. I would read Schopenhauer and just be so depressed, reading The World as Will and Representation. And just I remember having terrifying experiences where I would walk away from that experience literally not being able to justify to myself logically why I should continue living my life. And when you think about what that says about somebody, that is as far in a pit of despair as you can go, where you're having trouble justifying your own experience in your life. Why do I continue doing this? So that was probably the lowest I've ever felt in my life. And I really realized that God is giving me a path forward where if I live in accordance with truth, these transcendental things that we can interact with, these gifts that he gives us, it should come as no surprise to anybody that my favorite book, the Bible, from this gentleman here who unfortunately is always struggling existentially. My favorite book of the Bible is Ecclesiastes, and I would read that and I just see those arguments made in Ecclesiastes about, this earthly life is striving after wind. What is there to enjoy about this life? And I think that there's a bitter, beautiful truth in that book of we can serve God, keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of man. And I found such profound existential comfort within those lessons. And when I'm reading this, it was man, I finally have some reason and a nice logical underpinning for why I should continue my existence. So this is me being very candid about me staring despair in the face and what rescued me. It is a combination of all of those things happening at once in one pivotal moment of my life.
That's great. And I appreciate your candidness about it and your honesty. I preached through Ecclesiastes to my church sounds like about the same time that you were becoming a Christian, in the wake of COVID and all of the fear around it. And I remember thinking, why first of all, why is everybody so scared? But especially, why are so many Christians so scared? Christians are, often struggling and foolish and sinful, but of all people who, have at the center of their lives the resurrection of Jesus and the ultimate redemption of the universe, Christians should be the last people to be afraid of dying. And of course, we're all going to struggle with death, and death is the final battle and the final form of suffering, of course. But I remember preaching through Ecclesiastes at the time and trying to help encourage our people with facing the grim darkness of death, and that it is grim and that it is dark. And Ecclesiastes itself sometimes runs into some brick walls where the author is like, I don't really know what happens after people dies. And, are we really any better off than dogs when they die? I don't know. And he kind of gets to the end and he says, I'm not really sure how to put all this together, but we need to fear God. And I know there's a judgment coming. And there's these kind of little glimpses of that there is something beyond death. And that, of course, with Jesus coming, there is far more clarity about death, because he's the one person who's come back from death and promises to take us through it if we trust in him. So yeah, there's this, and I would try to, as I preach through it, I would try to remind people that a lot of us in America, especially, we're so optimistic about everything. We don't want to deal with dark things like this. And this is actually a mercy that God is reminding us that, no, there are some very dark things about life, even for the believer, for God's people. But there is a kind of comfort and a mercy in being able to accept that and not be consumed by it and not overwhelmed by it. We're full of despair. And it's great to hear how God's done that in your life.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with your assessment on Ecclesiastes. I just think it forces you to contemplate, very dark truths about our material, kind of finite earthly existence. And then Christ forces the ultimate clarity in opposition to that. So I think in terms of, looking at the issue, the profound existential questions that are facing us of our time, having those two things bookend each other, I think it worked well for me more than anything else, Ecclesiastes and then reading the Gospel of John.
Yeah, and I think, it was around that time, I think in the wake of, some of it was stuff related to COVID and the government's response to it. Some of it was it seems to have calmed down now some, but the kind of vehement kind of push for transgenderism, especially with children. We saw people at our church coming to faith out of a profound sense of darkness and evil, that it was real, that there are demons, and I don't know what to do about it. And there's something very dark going on. And it was the first time in my ministry that I'd seen people coming to faith kind of explicitly because of coming to accept evil, which was new for me, and it was surprising. But in some ways, the gospel, the good news, literally, is not good news until you have bad news. You have to understand the bad news before the good news is good. Otherwise, it's just some interesting advice or it's an interesting factoid. But it's only good if you understand what's wrong. And Christians are famous or infamous for being very negative, let's say, about the human condition and about what we are capable of. But I think that's actually a wonderful starting place for us to find something beautiful and good about what God can do and is doing and wants to do in the world. Bitcoiners, let's shift to Bitcoin. A lot of Bitcoiners are into Bitcoin because they have a very strong sense of evil and of, especially with the fiat inflation debasement system that we're living through. Bitcoiners kind of have eyes wide open on what is wrong with the world and what is wrong with the monetary system and much of the evil that comes because of it, whether it's intentional or not. And I've seen many Bitcoiners who are Christians and many Bitcoiners who are close to becoming Christians or who are sympathetic to it and open to it. And one thing that I think tends to help make that connection for them is this sense of evil and injustice and something that's wrong with the world and something that's wrong with us. How would you explain the way that Bitcoin, we don't know if Satoshi Nakamoto was a Christian, let's assume not, but how does his invention grapple with human evil? And why is this something that seems to be such a great solution to it? Tell us about that from how would you explain that?
Yeah, I think that Bitcoin acknowledges that scarcity must be real if money is to preserve claims across time. And when you think about money as an abstraction, it is a claim on a finite human life. And this is why Bitcoiners feel this such strong moral, visceral reaction to money printing and this debasement of the abstraction of our lives. We know that we only have so much time on this earth. And when you are faced with that truth of this system that we do live in, that we did inherit, a good analog was with what you just said about the how good kind of counteracts the bad. You need to be aware of what is bad in order to know what is good. And so I think there is a lot of overlap when Bitcoiners look at this traditional fiat system that we have inherited. I think that when you look at Bitcoiners temperamentally, they are truth-seeking individuals, and they have this distinct personality to them. I don't know if you've seen the research that's been done from the surveys about the personality types, but Bitcoiners are a very certain, interesting makeup of people who do feel this visceral reaction of evil in the world. I think that you see this with a lot of people presupposing almost that you need to be of a certain political ideology in order to get Bitcoin. There's such huge overlap with libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, which I have my own opinion on because I differ with a lot of Bitcoiners on this. But morality and human morality, it undergirds all of these things, whether it's, the way that you view the world through a political lens. And then, of course, obviously, your theological distinction also underpins those too. So I think that Bitcoiners they are encountering the world, they're seeing something that's unjust, and they feel that evil viscerally. And I think a lot of it is because Christian society in the West, it definitely is derived from Christian morality. And like, we know evil when we see it to a degree that we're not even aware that we are. And, that can go into the discussion of maybe atheists are a bit more Christian than they think that they are. But I think that Bitcoiners do inherit a lot of that Christian worldview, whether or not they're aware of it or not. And I think that they are feeling that evil because they have been programmed from their upbringing, living in this society that we live in. So that might be controversial to some, but That is my opinion.
Yeah, and in my experience, I think that's a lot of the reason why many Bitcoiners are more sympathetic to Christianity than, say, your average kind of consumeristic, self-oriented American who's out there. You don't have to convince a Bitcoiner that there's something really broken, not just with me, but as Christians would also argue, there's something wrong with us as a people and as a society. That evil goes a lot deeper than people just making kind of individual conscious decisions. Bitcoiners at some level are aware of that, and they don't need to be convinced like many people do. And many people think like, well, I'm a nice person and I mean well, so therefore end of discussion. Leave me alone. You were telling me earlier that your own kind of interest in Bitcoin and connection to Bitcoin wasn't necessarily what led you to become a Christian. Like, for some people, they become Christians out of their interest in Bitcoin because they're asking a lot of questions like what we're talking about, and it gets them eventually to Jesus. But you said that later you kind of started connecting the dots. Tell me about some of the dots that you started connecting after you became a Christian. Like, what is Bitcoin? People often ask me, what in the world? What does Christianity have to do with Bitcoin? It seems very strange to a lot of people who aren't in this world. What are some of these dots that you've connected?
Yeah, I think that Bitcoiners have this concept that they reiterate constantly, that Bitcoin is truth money. And what does that mean? Like, what is truth? And when you go down the Christianity religious rabbit hole and you become acquainted with concepts such as logos and this underlying structure of reality, that the universe is governed by these immaterial, invariant laws like mathematics and the laws of logic, and that things like beauty exist to us and we can experience these non-material truths. I think that once you really go down that rabbit hole and you get to know God as more of a rational conception than just some guy sitting on a cloud in the sky, you have to understand that there's been a lot of depictions of God in Western media for the last 100 years that people have been programmed with, and they don't necessarily have that proper conception of what, the gospel actually said about what God is and who God is and the incarnation, how God made himself known in the flesh. I think that same pursuit of truth, those same immaterial things, those concepts, the things that are appealing about God and what the Christian worldview tells you about existence, those same things are backing Bitcoin. It's money that is not, the value is not essentially made by decree, and it's based on the laws that are laid forth by God that govern our universe and creation. So I think that once you start asking those questions and going down that rabbit hole, you really start to see some overlap. And that's why it's so fascinating to see the overlap with the Bitcoin community and Christianity. And the dialogue is fascinating because the conversations I have had, a lot of us come to these conclusions in the same way.
Right. One of the dangers I've noticed with Bitcoiners is because, like you're noticing and saying, Bitcoiners are highly attuned to injustice and questions of morality. And it sounds bad to say it, but you have to be careful when you are treading on grounds of right and wrong, because being really excited about right and wrong does not necessarily mean you have become a Christian. The Pharisees, Jesus's famous opponents, they were ultra high attuned to injustice and to right and wrong. They were profoundly fixated on the Romans and how they were taking advantage of Judea, and they were profoundly fixated on how can God's people live righteously and live according to the truth. And yet they were very, very far from God. They were much farther from God than prostitutes, even tax collectors, which is going to make Bitcoiners cringe when they hear that Jesus was far more interested in tax collectors, and tax collectors are far more interested in him than the ultra super duper righteous people of his day. The people that everybody would have looked to and said, those guys have it figured out. Those guys are super hardcore. They're super disciplined. They're really generous. They've got it all figured out. And Jesus is constantly excoriating them and criticizing them because they're actually very far from God in their quest for truth and for morality. How do we as Christian Bitcoiners stay out of that danger zone? Or how do we stay excited about truth and justice without becoming the Pharisees who are so focused on right and wrong that we actually forget about why you need Jesus at all?
That is such an excellent question. I think that this is something I personally struggle with, is dealing with the subjectivity of my own personal experience and knowing whether or not I am acting in accordance with what is good and what is not good. I think that that's something fundamental to humans, and we know that we are infallible. We will always miss the mark. And I think that as it relates to Bitcoin and how we can try our best to avoid missing the mark, I think that if you do an honest accounting for what maybe Christian virtues actually are, I do think that Bitcoiners can look to what they actually do in their Bitcoiner life, and ask the question, are we cultivating Christian virtues? And I look and ask that question. To me, it feels like we are. Bitcoin brings a lot of humility. It teaches us patience and courage and stewardship, these things that Jesus teaches us about and the gospel reminds us of. So I think that it's very difficult to, that is the ultimate question of how we operate in the world, right? How do we know that we are acting good and we are seeking good and we're not becoming like Pharisees? I think that ultimately you need to make an accounting for what the Christian virtue is and seeing if you're acting in accordance with that as much as possible. Hopefully that's somewhat of a good answer.
Yeah, and I've been working with my kids on memorizing the Beatitudes, which is the very beginning of Jesus's Sermon on the Mount. And it's him, before he gives some very difficult and often stark moral instruction about how his disciples are supposed to live, things like love your enemies, don't even lust after a woman, let alone, commit adultery with her. These commands of Jesus that are very hardcore in many ways. But before he gets to any of that, he starts out pronouncing God's blessing on various groups of people that are all various forms of kind of being losers in the world's eyes. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Categories of people that in his world and in our world, we wouldn't normally think of as These are people who are successful. These are people who are winners. These are people who are going places. And sometimes I think, Jordan Peterson, sometimes he tries to explain what are the Beatitudes, and he ends up, I think he kind of explains them away. Like, well, meekness doesn't really mean meekness. It just means like, waiting to the right moment to like slice someone's head off. No, I'm sorry, Jordan Peterson. That's not what Jesus means. It is supposed to be shocking and offensive. And sometimes I think with Bitcoiners, there is this, because you are so excited about it and you are excited about right and wrong, and you see this great, wonderful solution to something that's profoundly evil. They really can struggle with some of these things that Jesus says. This is actually where God's blessing is. Humility, like you said, meekness, not considering yourself better than other people, living in profound gratitude for every single thing you have. What are some ways that you have found to do these things that you're talking about in terms of cultivating these kinds of characteristics, in spite of the temptations that Bitcoin presents to not do them, to be condescending, to sneer at the normies who don't get it? And we tell them, well, have fun staying poor, or, oh, I told you so. How and why, as a Christian Bitcoiner, do you keep yourself from that?
That is an excellent question, and it's something that I'm working on because I'm an extremely flawed individual. I need to do a better job of presenting myself, not only for the optics purposes of appearing to know what I'm talking about and being a man of moral character. I do think it's a question of wanting to be effective with your messaging to get the truth across to somebody who's willing to hear the truth. And hopefully it improves their life as well as, then they can be an advocate for the truth that will hopefully transform society to be living more in accordance with Christ. These are the things that I hope for as a Christian Bitcoiner. And for me, I'll just speak candidly about my struggle. It's knowing whether or not I'm going too far for attention's sake, where we are definitely, like you said, we do feel a bit of ego sometimes where you say, have fun staying poor. You guys just aren't going to get it. And maybe there is a degree of self-importance that we feel like this secret club that we get it, but you guys don't. It's tough to fall into that. And I'm not so sure if I have an answer for you because I struggle with that myself. When I'm constantly self-analyzing my own messaging, I send 30 tweets a day about Bitcoin and make content every single day. Am I reaching people the best possible way that I can? To me, it's
some of it.
Yeah, go ahead.
From what I think it's one thing when you're communicating to Bitcoiners themselves, and that's you're gonna speak in a different register than you would to people who don't get it quite yet. And I think part of it is knowing who you're talking to. But yeah, and like, of course, Jesus had some very hard things to say. He used very harsh, vivid language for people who didn't get it and wouldn't get it.
Yes.
And sometimes he was purposefully evasive about what he was saying. The parables in many ways are Jesus's way of keeping the truth from those who were spitefully against him. But it is important to communicate in a Christ-like way, and sometimes that's going to look like, harsh, strident language. And sometimes it's going to mean gentle concern for the weak. Jesus was the master, of course, in a way that none of us ever will be, of doing that. One of the things we do at Magnalia is talk to quite a bit with churches and with Christians who have heard of Bitcoin, are skeptical about Bitcoin, but are very quickly turned off by kind of the typical kind of Bitcoiner mode of speech. What advice would you give to people like us or to Christians who are in their churches who are so excited about Bitcoin and they want to get their pastors on board with it, they want to get their churches on board with it? How do they talk to these people in these institutions without completely turning them off? You know what I'm saying? Because we can so kind of quickly turn into that mode.
Yeah.
What have you figured out in terms of your own communicating about it?
Yeah. It's interesting because Christians, they are coming to the conversation with this idea. They might interpret a Bitcoiner as saying, here's a finite good that can fix this infinite problem, which we know that Bitcoin is not a replacement for God. People sometimes misinterpret my content where they think I'm idolizing Bitcoin, which is totally not true. So I think a lot of Christians who do bring Bitcoin forth, they need to be cognizant of how they are presenting it, because it seems like Bitcoiners, they do come across a bit fervorish and like religious in their tonality and their voice and the content of their speech. I think that you need to be really aware of how you're coming across, number one. And then number two, I would say you should probably be willing to express the problem before you can address the fix. And this is analogous to knowing what the problem is with human nature and why we are incomplete without God. And I think that having that Christian grounding, that proper understanding of humanity, and then altering your speech and the content of your case for Bitcoin and able to reach people, to me, that has helped me. But having those two bases covered, I think, is definitely a good start.
How do you advise people to deal with the inevitable scorn and rejection that you will face when you're trying to talk to people about Bitcoin?
My advice would be look at how Christ was scorned. Look at how all of the apostles were scorned. Look what Christ said. He was a very divisive figure, and he says he came to divide, and people don't like to acknowledge this a lot of the time. But when you look at Christ's speech in the gospel, a lot of this is it's very indicative of something that, is divisive to people. And I think that we as Christians, we live in this modern world with a lot of comforts, and maybe it's a lot more comfortable than, the early Christians 2,000 years ago. But you look at the persecution that other humans have endured with things that are I would argue, have a lot more consequences than what Bitcoiners deal with. So I think that having that perception will really humble you. I think that in this modern day and age, we have these first world problems, and I do think that Bitcoiners are no exception that we feel these things. There are dramatically more important issues as it relates to the problems that humans face of good and evil, and this profound existential question of how we spend our time on this world. But yeah, I would say look at what early Christians went through, look at the persecution. This is the price we pay for wanting to spread the truth. So you're always going to get scorned. You're not going to make everybody happy. That's just not something that will ever happen.
You were telling me that you have a young family. Tell me about why you think Bitcoin is something that's important, not just for a bunch of engineer nerds online, libertarian dudes, getting excited about it. Why should families care about this, and why should dads care about it?
I think that there's an answer that's moral, but there's also an answer that is maybe a bit more pragmatic, where you actually understand the magnitude of money printing and where to store this abstraction of our finite life energy. You want to be able to keep it in something with just weights and measures, which is a biblical teaching. And the reason why is a pragmatic accounting for the situation that we're being faced with, where you look at what the government calls healthy inflation, this 2 to 3% inflation, and then you crunch the math on what that means. It's 50% of your purchasing power being destroyed over 2 decades. This is a single generation where if you store your energy in something that can be debased, half of it's gone in 20 years. And when you think about the last 20 years, I was just in a conversation with somebody where we looked at the value of our childhood homes. You can actually look up your address on Google, go back 20 years, see what house our parents bought, and then what the price they paid for it, and it's 3 times the price. And have wages gone up 3 times for the average American? Absolutely not, or anybody probably in a fiat system with central banking. So I think there is a pragmatic, necessary case that needs to be made where Bitcoin solves that problem with its finite scarcity. Clearly, it's absorbing monetary premium from the other asset classes. This is a trend that continues to happen. You can smooth out the volatility. You can see this happen demonstrably. And I think that, you can ask the moral question as one piece of the puzzle there, but when you look at the pragmatic product market fit that Bitcoin solves, once you understand both sides of the equation, it's pretty obvious what the superior store of value should be for you and your family.
Right. Well, and kind of like you're saying too, when you have kids, that has a way of really kind of waking you up to think much more seriously about the future. Because now it's like, well, I've got this baby, and what kind of world is this baby growing up into, and how has God called me to help provide for this little baby? And so I think it has a way, not just with Bitcoin, but with all kinds of things. When people have kids, it gets them thinking a lot more seriously about being wise about the future. Last question, you mentioned volatility, and this is also related to the future. One of the most common concerns we hear as we talk to churches is people that are really stressed out about the risk of Bitcoin. The volatility, they're equating the volatility of Bitcoin with, therefore, Bitcoin is very risky. You have a lot of education content about kind of what Bitcoin has done in the past, what it's likely to do in the future, how to balance these things and think of the volatility, how to approach it, how to weather all of it. What should people understand, and what should Christians especially understand about the risk of Bitcoin and the volatility of Bitcoin and how those relate to each other? How do we live wisely as good stewards of what God has given us? Because a lot of Christians are worried that if I throw a bunch of money into Bitcoin and it dumps tomorrow, like Bitcoin's infamous for doing, I'm being a bad steward and I have failed. How do we live as good stewards with something that is so volatile?
Excellent question. I think that most people, they need to come to terms with acknowledging this fact that our society seems to get further and further away from, is that this concept of risk is omnipresent. Risk is everywhere. You never escape risk. You can get hit by lightning by walking into your friendly neighborhood grocery store. You never escape risk. And a lot of people, they do not understand the risk profile of the status quo. Like I was just saying about what healthy inflation does to your family's financial future after 2 decades. So I think that definitely undergirds a lot of the value proposition behind being willing to bear the spot dollar volatility of Bitcoin. And what really helps maybe is more of a pragmatic advice is I love looking at the 4-year moving average of Bitcoin. And not only that, but pricing other assets in Bitcoin using a smoothed out volatility. And that's because if you look at a 4-year moving average window, it smooths out the volatility where it's just taking a bunch of different 4-year snapshots and taking the average price in that snapshot, smooth it all together. And you see that other assets are being demonetized against Bitcoin by double-digit percentages using an average year over year. So this idea that there's these diminishing returns of Bitcoin and you don't want to buy the top and then sell the bottom, a lot of these can be alleviated by just understanding that Bitcoin is this deflationary free market that we all have access to right now. And we get to enjoy the spoils of these human advancements in technology where, maybe for once, human products and services can actually outpace the money printer. And you can see that when you view the world through a Bitcoin lens. So understand that risk is omnipresent and that there is a free market alternative where you can actually enjoy the spoils of our productivity. And you can see that demonstrably being true when you just price other assets in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is absorbing the monetary premium, and that's, to me, a necessity for my family's future.
It's great, man. Well, let's finish there. Give us a handoff where people can find you. Any other parting words of encouragement you'd offer to Christians and to the church with Bitcoin?
Yeah, I would say if you guys feel as Bitcoiners that Bitcoin is pointing you toward the truth, you should follow the truth all the way to Jesus, all the way to the divine logos. Start asking questions. Go to AI, steelman it. Feel free to do so. I think that you'd be pleasantly surprised. Ask questions. Reach out to me whenever. I'm sure Tim would love to have you reach out with questions. That's my encouragement. I just ask you to follow the rational inquiry into the truth. I think it'll lead you down the same rabbit hole that me and Tim are in. And you can find me at Adam B. Live on X. I post a lot of Bitcoin analysis there. And I have a YouTube channel, Adam Livingston BTC, where I talk about Bitcoin treasury companies. So you can find me on those 2 platforms. And thank you for having me, Tim. This was an awesome conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.